two, one, two, three.
Hello, welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. That's DSA as in Democratic Socialists of America. I'm Teresa Alt, the host for this program, and I'm here with Kathy Russell, social philosopher and community activist. Our topic today is Red Vienna. Why? Well, everybody knows about Ithaca's and Tompkins County's affordable housing crisis. And in the story of Red Vienna, we see some real inspiration about what a city can do. So, Kathy, say something about how you found out about Red Vienna.
I was invited to participate in a conference in Vienna that was organized by Transform Europe and the Rosa Luxemburg Institute of Berlin, Germany. And it's called a Marxist Feminist International Conference. So 2 other philosophers and I went to this conference. I spoke about alliances between anti-racist activists, environmental activists, and economic rights activists. So I was talking about social movements, and it was interesting to me since I knew that Teresa had something to do with Vienna. Having heard her talk about it before, I said, "Teresa, have you ever been to Vienna? And can you recommend anything for me to see?" And sure enough, she said, "Oh, you should see Red Vienna. You should see Karl Marxhof." And so I said, "Really? Tell me more." So I found out about Red Vienna from you, Teresa.
Right. And I found out about it from my mother, my family. My family is from Vienna, lived there in the 1920s and most of the 1930s, and were socialists there, part of the socialist movement. Even one of my grandmothers was part of the movement. And on a recent visit to some very distant relatives, I learned that a museum had been opened in the famous housing development, the Karl Marxhof. So I visited the museum. I was very impressed, and I told Kathy to visit it. And so I suppose you can now start telling what you saw there.
Well, it was very exciting because I've been a Marxist philosopher for over 40 years. So the notion that there was a great apartment complex called the Karl Marxhof was interesting to me. And I wanted to be sure to visit it. I didn't really know what Red Vienna was, and I found out that it was actually the nickname for the city of Vienna between 1919 and 1934, when there was a civil war and the country was taken over by the fascists. But if you think about what happened between 1919 and 1934, what was going on in 1919? That was the end of World War I. So the social conditions there were desperate. There were refugees, there were soldiers, and the middle class had fallen into poverty because of hyperinflation. Mm-hmm. So you had a housing crisis there that was responded to with socialist ideas. Socialism had been popular in Austria since the end of the 19th century. There was a city parliament election in May of 1919. The Social Democrats won. And the electoral base for the Social Democrats was the working class. So these new housing complexes, like the Karl Marx Hof, represented the solidarity and the empowerment of a whole class, the working class. That's very inspiring to me, that a city government was run with leadership from the working class, and that it was the vision of working class emancipation that fueled that vision. So I was very excited to go to this museum. It was at the Karl Marx Hof, which is a big apartment complex. It doesn't have a whole bunch of different apartment buildings. It's a complex that is called a city within a city. It's a big block.
Well, actually, it covers several blocks.
Well, it's a mile long, in fact.
I didn't realize it was that long.
It is
I thought
that
I had
long.
walked the length of it.
Well, I know you do a lot of walking. So it was a mile long. If you walk the length of it, it was a mile long. That in fact, Red Vienna, it's not just, I thought, well, maybe this is the apartment complex, it's called Red Vienna, but it's the whole period of history.
Yeah.
That's controlled by the Social Democrats of Vienna, of the country, but also particularly of Vienna. So Karl Polanyi, a philosopher, an economist, an anthropologist, and lived in Vienna at the time. And he said of Vienna, Vienna achieved one of the most spectacular cultural triumphs of Western history, an unexampled moral and intellectual rise in the condition of a highly developed industrial working class, which, protected by the Vienna system, withstood the degrading effects of grave economic dislocation and achieved a level never reached before by the masses of people in any industrial society. So, to me, that is an inspiring fact of history and an inspiring vision. So, the residents of the city not only faced poverty, but very, very high levels of disease, such as tuberculosis, which was even called internationally the Vienna disease. There was so much tuberculosis. And of course, at that part of the 20th century, people began to realize that actually disease was connected to social conditions. So if you have people living in overcrowded apartments, you have people in the streets, you have people with not enough food, not an access to clean air and clean water, you've got the very conditions that are going to give rise to disease and despair and depression. So the city government, the council, decided that they were going to respond in a way that valued the vision of the working class and valued class solidarity. Mm-hmm. So at that time they had a collectivist vision.
Yeah. I think one thing one might just put in here is that Austria already considered it quite proper for government to play a serious role in, you might say, economic life. I mean, for instance, in the 19th century, railroads were first developed by entrepreneurs there, like here, but where here they went on to become private companies in the United States that did some pretty awful things to farmers. In Austria, once it became clear that they were a utility, the government took them over, and they were the Royal and Imperial Railroads. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing that had been established already. The assumption that it's quite proper, you have a need, government steps in to fill it.
And indeed, the government did step in to fill a need. Infrastructure was in very poor condition. A lot of it had been destroyed. And so they built up the infrastructure. They created bridges. Not only did they build housing, they created 380 housing projects, housing thousands of people with 64,000 units. They took down the old gas lights and put up electric lights, so people had lights in the streets, which of course helps you feel secure. I think socialism is about social security, and what does it really mean to live a life in which you are able to fulfill your individual capacity, but you're also able to feel secure as you walk through the streets, as you are in your home. So it's not national security from a socialist point of view isn't just having enough guns to protect your country from invasion. National security is actually having enough food, having clean air, having clean water. And so that is very interesting to me, because we can look to Red Vienna, that period in history, to see how the government stepped forward and provided that. So, for example, there was a Work Councils Act that gave workers the right to participate in company decisions. So,
wow,
I mean,
that's a century ahead of its time.
That's a century. Well, it was in the spirit of the times, given the conditions in Europe and given the interest in socialism and the guiding light of the socialist revolution in the Soviet Union, which didn't turn out so great. But nevertheless, in 1919, it was still, even in this country, people were really excited about socialism. It's hard to imagine today. But
well, no, it's not hard to look at Bernie Sanders. It's not hard to imagine today. We've seen it again.
That's true. That's true. I remember he said at the DNC that 18 million people voted for him in the primaries. And as a person who's just grown up since the late 40s in this country, it's hard for me to even imagine that 18 million people would vote for a person who said he was a democratic socialist. So you're right to check me on that. But the government did have a role, and it had a lot of achievements. It created the 8-hour day regulations, using government to protect the security of the working class and of everybody. 8-hour days, a 48-hour work week, which might seem to us is a little bit too long, although a lot of us do work even more than 48 hours a week. But at that time, that was a limit, because workers worked 7 days a week for maybe 15 or 18 hours a day. They had horrible conditions. So they got unemployment insurance. They even provided over 23 open-air swimming pools for children. And that was important not only for the children's recreation and not only for the parents' happiness so that the kids would have something to do, but also because, remember, in the early 1920s and after the war, they didn't have public facilities like that, nor did they have in their private dwellings access to a toilet, access to a bath or a shower. And so that was something that was a really a public need.
Yeah. Well, there was the project of Red Vienna, or the project, these housing projects, looked to provide more than just shelter. Mm-hmm. They had kindergartens, they had clinics, they had dental clinics, and they had a lot of sports facilities. I mean, sports was considered very much a part of the project. There were socialist sports clubs, and family legend in my family has it that my late aunt, when she was a teenager in, I guess, the 1920s, and a tall, slim, pretty young woman, marched around the Ring Street, that's one of the main streets of Vienna, in the May Day parade, wearing a red bathing suit and shouting, "Only Red Vienna builds swimming pools."
Oh, really? Oh, that's neat.
Nur die Rote Gemeinde Wien baut Bäder.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Which I very much remembered here when Ben Nichols, as mayor, spearheaded the building of the Alex Haley Pool downtown.
Right.
A very small swimming pool.
And a working class neighborhood where people could just walk there.
Yeah.
They didn't have to get on a bus. They walk for long periods of time, dragging children in towels. It was right there in the neighborhood, and that's very much the spirit of socialism as far as I can tell. After the war, there were people who were homeless that were squatters in the Vienna woods. And so they had self-sufficient encampments where they grew their own food, raised their own livestock, and taking the lead from the people, the socialist government built houses there in what is now the perimeter of Vienna, terraced homes, some of which are there even today. So it wasn't only these big housing complexes, but it was also small houses, and following the leadership and the participation of working class people.
But it is the big houses, the big blocks like the Karl Marx Hof that housed many, many people. And by the way, they were solidly built. They are still in use today, and I think very happily inhabited by people who put their, window boxes full of flowers out.
Yes, as is the wont of Europeans. They have beautiful trailing geraniums and lobelia that are a magnificent sight. And I was there in the beginning of October, and they were still blooming. It was really, really beautiful to see. The Karl Marx Hof is very aesthetically pleasing. There are 4 statues, large statues. The architecture of the building is with an eye to the social uses of the building, and inspired not only by Enlightenment values, but also by, in particular, socialist values, which of course is a philosophy of the Enlightenment. But there was these 4 massive statues on the side of the building off the courtyard, and Enlightenment, liberation, welfare, and physical culture. So it was really amazing to hear, as a philosopher, to hear those values of enlightenment, liberation, welfare, and physical culture manifested in these statues. The Karl Marx Hof has 5 great arches that complement these statues. So that way they conceived of these great city blocks, these cities within cities, was that they were going to emphasize the collective and de-emphasize the private. So not everybody was expected to have their own private little house with their own washing machine and their own kitchen facilities and their own shower and their own everything. No, lessen the emphasis on the private. So it's a new philosophy of the relationship between the private and the public. So not everybody has their own street access, but what they do have is access to a beautiful public courtyard. There were kindergarten facilities open from 2 in the Karl Marx Hof, 2 kindergartens on either side of this massive public courtyard, and with playgrounds in them. These kindergartens were open from 7 in the morning to 6 at night. As a socialist feminist, it was very, very important to me that they had a mother's clinic, but also a center for maternity advice and birth control advice. Okay. In 1919, it was the first time that all men and women too, even before the U.S., had the right to vote. So there was men and women voting this Social Democratic Party into the parliament of the city. And women were in the leadership just as we saw in the Paris Commune of the 1870s. Women are in the leadership. Women are in the barricades. Women are providing for the sort of domestic needs that they have. So a kindergarten, a birth control center, maternity advice, laundry facilities, showers, baths, and also workshops, event rooms, lots of amenities that are not replicated in every single house or apartment, but that can be made publicly available. It's less expensive. It's from our perspective today, when we're so concerned with energy consumption, not having everybody with their own dishwasher and washing machine, but having people share them. That's a good value. In fact, in the 1970s, I lived in a socialist feminist commune. There were 7 adults and 2 kids. My kid and another kid were a year old. So I only had to cook 1 night a week. I only had to shop once every 7 weeks.
Wow.
And we had a certain segment of the collective areas of the house that we were responsible for cleaning. Mm-hmm. And we shared childcare. So socialist feminism seeks to unify the reproductive aspects of life and the productive aspects of life, and really seek the leadership of women to say, what do you need to make your domestic life possible? And how can we collectivize it so that our social needs are met?
And well, I think the attention to the needs of children is something that really, really has to be emphasized here. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's even reflected in this architectural thing that you mentioned, that while the buildings are all around you might say, have their backs on the streets, all around the block, they open onto this courtyard, which, come to think of it, it's very nice if you can let the kids go out and play in the courtyard and not have to use the street.
That's right.
But paying attention to to the needs of children was really very much a part of the program. There's a quotation from one of the leading figures, Julius Tandler. If you build palaces for children, you are tearing down prison walls.
What does that mean to you?
Well, you could actually take it in slightly more than one way. One is, if you treat children well, they won't grow up to be criminals.
That's true. Right. Definitely.
A slightly different thing is, by treating children well, you liberate them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not only will they not do bad things, but they'll come to understand what good things they can do.
Yes. And the children have rights. And men and women have rights as parents. But meeting these rights is not only that individual's responsibility, but from a collectivist perspective, the obligation to see that those rights are met, the rights for housing, the rights for clean air and water. The responsibility is a social responsibility, and it's an obligation that can be filled through the government services. Public services, from this perspective, are not something to be slashed, as we see under neoliberalism, but public services are something that enhances individual freedom. I mean, after all, a woman is more free if she can share the kindergarten responsibilities with some of her other friends. Some of the options to put her child down in the courtyard and have them play down there, rather than just having them play underfoot while she's trying to get dinner together. So government obligations and the fulfillment of social services actually make individuals more free. And that's a good socialist perspective to remember.
but there was a lot done there also just at a very practical level. So I saw a cute picture of a row of children standing there brushing their teeth. They were in a in a childcare program, and they were being taught there how to brush your teeth.
Ah. Which reminds me, they had a dental clinic.
Oh, yes.
At Karl Marx Hof.
Yeah. But the other thing that I think we need to realize is the tradition continues in Vienna and has bloomed into something new. So on a visit to Vienna, maybe 10 years ago, friends said, "Oh, you must see the Hundertwasser house. It's a very unusual, architecturally unusual, colorful building conceived of by an artist, maybe reminiscent a bit of the style of Gaudi, but inside it are regular apartments for ordinary people." And we walked around and we gawked at the weird architecture, and we looked at the big plaque on the front, and it said, "Built by the city of Vienna." In other words, 70 or so 60 years after the Karl Marx Hof, the tradition of public housing was established enough, had the confidence to do something really experimental that draws tourists from around the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think, as I say, Ithaca could get a little inspiration from the story of the Karl Marx Hof and Red Vienna. We were both, I think we can say, very impressed by our visits.
Yes, Vienna is such a beautiful city. And the socialists between 1919 and 1934 brought out the beauty of that city, the tradition of it.
So, bringing you Red Vienna, this has been Kathy Russell. I'm Teresa Alt. This has been DSA Presents. Good night.
Good night.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.